Good afternoon. The best laid plans. Of course, as the clock goes on, though, there's fewer questions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all for your patience. Mr. Scalise, NASA maintains an internal independent verification and validation process that it applies to its mission-critical software. This assurance process is performed in addition to and not in lieu of software design and project verification and validation. This process is independent of the project design team and seeks to answer several questions. 1, did the design team miss anything? 2, did the design team design the right thing? 3, does the design system work? Today, the IV&V facility supports dozens of projects across the mission directorates. Each year, however, program coverage is restricted as insufficient funds have been requested each year by NASA, significantly increasing agency risk related to safety and mission-critical software rework. IV&V's customers have identified the value added of IV&V work, noting, quote, IV&V has unequivocally become some of the best systems engineers on the program. Their depth of knowledge contributes continually. Quote, IV&V discovers issues that no one else is capable of discovering. Quote, your IV&V staff demonstrates an outstanding ability to know when to bring forward issues to be resolved. Mr. Scalise, do you share the same opinions as those I've just reiterated, and that IV&V adds valuable review to NASA's systems and accordingly contributes cost savings and mission success?
Certainly, IV&V focuses on the software and the interaction of the software with the hardware, and yes, they do definitely provide a value-added service to the missions that they support.
Do they contribute to cost savings and to mission success?
Yes, they do. It's a little harder to. It's always hard to determine the cost savings because when you find something, you don't always know what the cost would have been if you didn't do it. But I'm sure that it's there, just a little bit harder to quantify. Mission success is a lot easier to demonstrate by the fact that we have fewer software issues with our missions.
Is that a fact with the use of IV&V processing?
Again, some of these things are very difficult to go off and quantify specifically. We believe that we need an independent process to review all of our activities, in fact. IV&V looks at software, and they come at it from an independent viewpoint. That, as we do in other areas, as you know, where we look at our designs and we bring in an independent team to look at the overall design, the overall architecture of a system, brings some real value because they ask questions that sometimes the team didn't think about. They look at it in a way that's different from the team. And therefore, it brings forward issues or identify things that could be done better. So clearly, the IV&V activity is a value-added activity.
Does it follow reason to conclude then that if such activities are curtailed or limited, NASA's safety and mission-critical software are placed at greater risk?
I'd have to go off and see what the limitations are. There's a very rigorous process that our team looks at for determining which missions don't get IV&V. So we try and make sure that all of our critical missions, where there's new development software, do in fact get IV&V. They try and limit the ones that don't get IV&V or get a minimal set of IV&V, if you will, for cases where there's true software reuse, where there isn't very much risk in the system. I'd have to go off. I don't have off the top of my head what the exact specifics are on that, but I'm pretty sure that critical missions get the full IV&V, and that most missions get some some fraction, some portion of the IB&V activity.
Would you supply that for the record,
We will.
please? IB&V has continuously sought funding to allow broader coverage of mission and safety critical software for each project selected for each project for IB&V and to cover the cost increase of the agency's security support contract. Why then has NASA headquarters consistently constrained the IB&V's annual budgetary requests?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. The security support contract? I don't think I...
Both security and software review, John is telling me here. IB&V has continually sought funds to allow broader coverage of mission and safety critical software for each project selected for IB&V and to cover the cost increase of the agency's security support contract.
I can't
Does that
answer
make
the
sense
last
to you?
part. We'll have to probably go off and look at that. Clearly, the IB&V has, well, I'm not sure that I know what the latest request is. I'd have to take that one for the record.
Okay, well, let me understand that a little better, too, and we'll both come back to it.
Okay.
How's that? The budget for IB&V of software has remained fairly constrained over the last several years, augmented mostly by Congress. However, would you agree that the requirements for IB&V are projected to increase, kind of referring to what you alluded to with regard to critical missions, significantly to Constellation ramping up while existing programs, shuttle, ISS, and nominal science missions continue?
Hard to answer that question. Clearly, we'd have to look at the mission profile. As missions complete, of course, we don't need to do IB&V as the shuttle is coming down and Constellation is going up. If we had a net increase in all of our missions, I would say yes. But I have to look at how many missions are coming down the activity and how many missions are going up in activity. To a first order, I would say we've been relatively flat with the number of missions that we have. But, I mean, when you look at missions that are coming off their design and missions that are coming up the design curve. So about a flat level is about right for the software, as well as for our standing review boards. Looking at standing review boards is another way to look at it, and they stay about the same annually as well in terms of numbers. But again, we can get you the numbers on what the projected growth or projected number of projects is.
Dr. Weiler, would you anticipate that the requirements for IB&V will increase beyond planned rates as additional investments are made in Earth-observing systems that were not projected in your fiscal year 09 budget?
Well, I can't give you a specific thing without going into every single mission, but what Chris said is probably accurate in space science, too, because the budget, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, has been flat. So the number of missions being launched or coming out of development probably offsets the number of missions that are going into development. So, what we'll have to do now is with the Earth Science stimulus package and some acceleration in some of those missions, we'll have to look at our needs for IB&V, in the future years. But in general, for at least the past 3 or 4 years, the space science, Earth science budget has been flat and not even keeping up with inflation.
Dr. Cook, do you anticipate that the requirements for IB&V will increase beyond planned rates as additional and new investments come online?
I'm sure that is this working?
If the button is lit, it is.
It wasn't working earlier. I'm sure that as we are defining the work and development of software, we'll be looking at the requirements for that in the future, and it will be weighed against other programs in the agency in terms of how that affects the overall budget.
Will you say that again, please?
Yes, we'll be looking at our requirements for independent verification, validation, as we get into further development, and that will be weighed in as a part of the overall agency requirements.
Sure. I was asking about your anticipation for its potential increase, given the increase.
Well, in terms of our part of it, possibly.
Yeah, if I can interject, clearly as Constellation goes up, because they are new projects there, they're going to have a demand for the IV&V services. At the same time, shuttle demand and the station demand is going down. And those are the things that we have to look at. We look at it every year. And I can get you the results of that, but I can't recall it off the top of my head.
What's your plan to, Ms. Scalise, to fully obligate in this fiscal year, 09, the $45 million provided in the fiscal year 09 appropriations?
We intend to obligate, we're working to obligate close to 100% of our funding.
No, so that's right. So you're not planning on carrying over any funds?
Well, that's different. We can obligate the funding, and if we need to carry over some fraction of that to carry us into the next fiscal year, whether it's for costing on fixed price contracts where you have to pay for the work ahead of time, or whether it's a cost that will be accrued in the subsequent year, would have to be worked.
The whole idea of closing the gap by accelerating areas of Orion, we're beyond that. Is that correct? I think the date for making that decision to go with attempting acceleration or not was March of 09. And
I think that's yes, that's correct.
But are we beyond that? That is no longer an option.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, there's no significant acceleration that can occur.
I mean, it would not be possible to do it at this point. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Scalise, I commend you and those under your leadership at NASA for the strides that you've taken to engage young people in the sciences. I would also like to recognize Joseph M. Joe Acaba, who you also mentioned in your written statement. I was looking at transcripts a couple of years ago wherein being very supportive of NASA, I said it would look good for the community if someone identified with the Puerto Rican community went up in space. A lot of jokes were made at that time, good humor, but it happened. And I commend you for that because diversity is important. And I don't know if you saw the writings in New York, New Jersey, Florida, and in Puerto Rico. It was a great moment of pride. And not only because he is who he is, but because of his role as a school teacher for middle and high school students. And it conveys a powerful message to young people across the nation about the endless possibility within the realm of science. Currently, African Americans represent 12% of the population, but only 8.7% of bachelor's degree recipients in the science and engineering fields in 2006. In addition, Hispanics now represent about 15% of the U.S. population, but only 8% of students graduating with a bachelor's degree in science or engineering field in the same year. As you note in your written statement, NASA has considerably ramped up its targeted educational support to research grants and universities, including minority-serving institutions, as well as its efforts to provide students with opportunities in science, internships, and hands-on education. I'm also particularly pleased with the way NASA has embraced new technologies, such as Twitter and other online resources, in an effort to engage young people in the exciting work that you do. Can you talk a bit more about how NASA is helping to prepare young people for careers in the sciences and technology fields? I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on how NASA might be able to further bridge the gap in terms of how space sciences relate to more well-known issues such as climate change and green technology.
Certainly, and thank you for covering the items that you did. In fact, I just signed out our annual report that's coming over to the Congress on our support of minority institutions for higher education. So you should be getting those statistics here very shortly. I think you covered well many of the things that we're doing. In addition to what you said, we have programs clearly where we allow, have discussions with the crews on the space station, where they take opportunities to talk to local schools, secondary schools, primary schools, to relate directly to the students, where they have an opportunity to talk to them. Email will be an opportunity as well. We've been working, as you noted, with our websites to make them much more friendly, and we have a kids section on the NASA website so that people can go off, younger people can go off and be motivated by what's going on. In addition, in the societal end of things that you were talking about, NASA is very much engaged in climate research, in weather, in providing data to operational agencies, providing it to industry, providing it to universities for use in a broad range of activities. In fact, it's probably almost too numerous to mention, but a few that come to mind is we have satellites that help us to better understand, predict the track and predict the severity of hurricanes. The TRMM satellite does that. It was an experimental mission. We intend to extend that, working with our partners in the international community and in others in the U.S. government. It's called the Global Precipitation Mission. We have missions that are used, or instruments and missions that are used by operational agencies. The MODIS instruments on Aqua and Terra are very much used by the operational agencies in the prediction of weather and climate. And there's many other instruments that do that as well. We support other agencies around the world. In fact, tracking forest fires is something that the MODIS instruments are very good at doing, and have been used most recently in California in conjunction with unpiloted vehicles, UAVs, that we have to help firefighters better determine what fires they need to fight, where the fire front is, where to place their resources, and doing that with a combination of satellites and UAVs so that it minimizes the risk to humans. So I think there's lots of examples that we have out there, and in addition, our website has many of these listed on it, plus some very practical home applications that NASA has been engaged in. Hope that answers your question, sir.
Yeah, I encourage you to continue to expand. I've been the recipient of your services, if you will, in astronauts and other folks visiting schools. And I would commend anyone, if they know in their community that this is happening, to go and see this. I don't know that there's a more exciting event to attend in a school, other than graduation, maybe, especially when you say, or last day of school, period, than to see the astronauts. Everyone understands it. It's exciting. It's one of the few occasions, or it's an occasion, I'm not going to say few, where the teachers are excited as students, because there's this romantic thing and dramatic and special. So I would continue to expand your work within the schools. It's good for the agency, it's good for the children, it's good for the country. And whatever NASA can do to continue to encourage people from certain communities to study in the sciences and math and to expand that horizon, that would be a good thing.
Okay.
But I stand ready, as I've been in the past, and I am now a member of this committee once again, to be supportive in every way I can.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. Mr. Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on what the question I had asked you about the length of service of the administrator, can you kind of tell me what was the length of service? Griffin was there a certain time. What from your tenure that you've been there, how long did a general administrator generally stay? And what has been the longest that you know of since the beginning of NASA?
I think Dan Golden had the longest service at about 10 years, I think. And then Jim Webb was, who was, I guess, the second administrator in NASA, was about 8 or 9 years. I would guess the average service is about 4 years, maybe a little more, a little less. In my recollection, in my tenure at NASA, the administrators have been Admiral Truly, Dr. Fletcher,
Who was the
Dan
first
Golden.
administrator?
The first administrator at NASA, Glennon, I believe. T. Keith Glennon, Dr. Glennon.
And how long was he there, do you know?
He was there at the very beginning, and then Jim Webb came up, so I'm not sure, maybe 2 years, 3 years. That was in the transition from the old NACA to NASA.
I think I think I heard this question, but let me just elaborate a little bit more. Last November, Business Week published a very disturbing report about a string of cyber attacks on NASA's computer systems. In 2005, NASA's computer networks were compromised, and it was only detected 7 months later after millions of pages of information had been rerouted to Taiwan. Attacks have continued, including in 2007 intrusion into Goddard Center satellite data. Do you continue to experience these attacks? Number one.
Our systems are attacked, and we have, of course, we take precautions against that, and I'd prefer not to discuss what we do in public. That wasn't one.
The NASA OIG was quoted that, quote, the scope, sophistication, and timing and hostile characteristics of some of these intrusions indicate they are coordinated or essentially managed. The sources, do you know the sources of them? China, Russia?
We know the sources of some of them, sir, and some of them are from foreign nationals. Again, this is something I prefer to discuss.
Sure,
Yeah, separately.
But I wonder, without asking you, what would the problem be of saying who it is, though? I mean, it's probably China. China came in and stripped a number of members' computers, the IR committee's computer, a number. They've done. It seems to me that the administration ought to just say who it is, but I'm not going to pressure on that. But
Okay.
you do know who.
Yes, sir.
Who it is. Has there ever been a full assessment of who has gained what information and what national security impacts have these breaches had?
Yes, sir. There have been.
Have there been any accounting of the value of the intellectual property that's been stolen?
Yes, sir.
And have any criminal charges been filed?
Only I know that there have been. I can't recall exactly who, but I know there's been at least a couple of cases where criminal charges have been filed, and there may have been more.
Well, without asking you, maybe sometime we can chat about it privately, but my guess is that some of the progress that China has made has probably come from cyber attacks, you know. Anyway, thank you very much thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Mr. Scalise, NPOS. What are we going to do about NPOS?
Let me take a step back. NPOS is not a NASA project.
No, I understand it's not NASA. It's NOAA, DOD, and NASA. And
NASA's role in NPOS is limited to 2 areas.
You have no money in NPOS, I don't think. Yeah.
Yeah, we do technology development, and we are also providing what's called the NPOS preparatory project. It's a satellite that's going to fly several instruments. That mission, we directly know. The NPOS satellite and its instruments, we know peripherally, and I can't give you, great detail on those other than to tell you that they're delayed.
No, I know you can't, but you kind of have a unique background, and the fact that you're not at the center of it kind of put you in position of, I think, maybe commenting on it more objectively.
Okay. Let me start with the good parts, if I will.
Sure.
In NPOS, one of the things that's been demonstrated is a very strong relationship between NASA and NOAA. I think we have had a long-term relationship, as you may recall, with the early polar orbiting satellites, TIROS and GOES, and NPOS has demonstrated, again, the importance of that relationship. I think it's strengthened the operational weather community to an extent as they see common need for data. So those are some of the good things that I think have come out of it. I think the NPOS preparatory project, as we call it, is a demonstration of the flexibility of what we can do, given the resources and given the support of our sister agencies. While it hasn't flown yet because of delays in the VIIRS instrument and the CRIS instrument, we were able to add relatively quickly critical climate instruments, the Ceres instrument, and the OMPS. It's an ozone monitoring instrument, limb sounder, to that mission relatively quickly. And so when it launches, it will be an addition to and help fill in the gaps that are anticipated from the aging of the EOS satellites that carry similar instruments. The problems that we've experienced on NPOS are serious. They threaten the continuity of our weather satellite system. That's of serious concern, serious enough that the NPP mission has now become I'll put it in terms of quasi-operational mission. It's required to make sure that there isn't a gap in the afternoon orbit now. And that was never the intent of the NPP mission. So that demonstrates flexibility, but it also demonstrates the frailty of the system that we've got. We certainly need to look along the lines of what we were talking about earlier at how we got here. I think it's a combination of underscoping of the initial set of requirements when they were put together. And I think it demonstrates that the need for strong government oversight over complex developments. And I probably can't go much more than that into it without speculating on the specifics of the NPOS arrangement.
Well, given your experience, what observations, and you sit around and talk about it, what should happen? How should it move forward? I mean, if DOD and NOAA aren't working well together, and I don't know, their budget overrun tolerances are different, what advice would you give for, if you have any, for moving forward?
I think the advice I would give would be to look carefully at the contract that's in place to make sure that we're getting the information and the responsiveness that is desired to get this system launched to minimize or eliminate the possibility of a gap in the weather record. The clarity overall on the requirements. There's been an excellent process to define what the requirements are for this system, and we need to make sure that those are being satisfied, one, and second, that there is flexibility to deal with issues that come up with any development where you may not be able to achieve the optimum, the desired spec, but you can obtain a good enough, if you will. It's better than what we have today, but maybe not the ideal that everybody wants. And there has to be a process that would allow us to go off and do that. We're working with the Department of Defense and NOAA on doing both of those things. But the specifics of the contract, again, those are my observations. You'd have to ask them as to what to do specifically, or what could be done specifically with the contract. But those would be the two major things that I would say that we need to do. Take a good look at at the contract, and are we getting what we expected in terms of data, in terms of responsiveness? And if we are, fine. If not, we should make changes. And second, we need to be able to look at the requirements, because we haven't launched the system yet, and determine how much flexibility we have in meeting those requirements so that we can minimize the probability of a gap in our weather.
You're noted in the Aerospace Safety Advisory Report saying, quote, "The U.S. Air Force-led in-post development delays represent a threat to NASA's science budget and ability to meet the Earth Science Decadal goals established by NRC and endorsed by Congress." Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, sir. When the NPOS program was originally conceived, it was to do both weather and carry on the climate measurements of the EOS satellites. Those satellites were launched in the late 90s, 1999, and the early 2000s. Most of them, not all, but the two critical ones, Terra and Aqua, from the perspective of NPOS, are now at or well beyond their design life. So while they're operating fine now, when you're far beyond your design life, you don't always know how much longer they're going to operate and how well they're going to operate beyond that design life. So without these satellites to fill in when these sensors do eventually die, we have a risk of losing that data, and it's a very critical data set for the climate community. And as I mentioned earlier, it's something that's being used actively by the operational communities for weather and other services. So that's one risk that we obviously have in the loss of data. What that's meant is that we may have to expend additional resources that we weren't planning on doing. The decadal missions assumed NPOS would be there. The NASA planning prior to that assumed NPOS would be there. So now we have to go off and look at our plans to see if we need to fill in critical gaps. So that's one that puts the decadals at risk. And clearly, NPP was supposed to have launched 3 years ago? 3 or 4 years ago. And the satellite has been ready. So we've had to pay the carrying cost for that mission. So there's a direct cost associated with the delays in the NPOS project to NASA. And that was what I was trying to get at.
A different topic, NASA's Enhanced Use Lease Authority was first enacted in 2003 and allowed NASA to enter into a demonstration project for EULs at 2 NASA centers. Ames Research Center was selected as a demonstration center. In 2007 and again 2008, NASA's EUL authority was amended to extend the EUL authority to allow NASA to use its authority in all of its centers, limited the consideration NASA may receive in cash, and added a sunset date of 10 years. These provisions of law became effective in July of 2008. The NASA Authorization Act of 2008 clarified how the funds should be expended, established percentages of the net revenue that were to remain at the center, 65%. With 35% being placed in the agency capital asset account. NASA received $6.5 million in 2007 from EUL receipts, $9.8 million in 2008 were advised, and a projection of $15.7 million in 2009 we were advised, and $15.7 million in 2010. A projected $76.6 million is projected to be collected over the 5-year budget horizon from Ames, principally. The fiscal year 2009 omnibus placed a limitation on EUL expenditures of $9 million. In February, NASA headquarters placed a moratorium on all new EUL agreements. Why did you do that?
First, it was very simply, we had completed the pilot and we needed to collect our lessons learned and understand where we were and where we were going if we were to expand it to the other centers for use, to determine better, when enhanced use leasings are used, what that means, how are we going to go off and implement them efficiently. We had done it at 2 centers, as you mentioned, as pilot projects. We learned from that. We had some legislation, as you also indicated, that we wanted to incorporate in it. We also wanted to understand where do we use enhanced use leasing versus Space Act agreements. So we took a hiatus to go off and understand that and codify that, collect the lessons learned. We're about to lift the moratorium very shortly here with revised guidelines, clearer guidelines for all of our organizations. So that's why we did it. We wanted to collect the lessons learned and understand where we're at. I might point out that we've learned a lot, and in those few years that we had the pilot projects, and we're looking at some I think very good uses of land that have easements on them because we want to have them protected, either because rocket testing you just can't use the land. So we're looking at some of our facilities, Plumbrook in Ohio, Kennedy Space Center, to put in green energy activities where we could allow industry to come in, and whether those are enhanced use leases or Space Act agreements, we can now go off and address those questions and determine what makes the most sense. So we're looking to the future as well as looking to the past to see how we can go off and improve our use of enhanced use leases.
During that time out, you significantly changed the accounting of the enhanced use leasing program at Ames. Why did you do that?
Actually, we found an error, and if you want to go into details, I can ask the comptroller to come forward. But the simple answer is that we incorrectly accounted for income from agreements with other federal agencies, which we shouldn't do. They don't pay us rent; they just pay for the services that they use, as opposed to a commercial entity that would pay for rent. And we incorrectly kept those in the account, and we shouldn't have done that.
What occasioned discovering that error?
As I said, when we took the time out to go off and understand what we learned from the past, what we wanted to do in the future, and bringing into account all of the legislation that goes along with it, is when we discovered it.
Describe, please, the effect of the committee's action on placing an obligation limitation of $9 million on the expenditure of EUL revenue in fiscal year 09.
That was one of the things that allowed us to, as we were learning about EUL, was one of the things that we considered as we were looking in this moratorium. As it turns out, when we took out the federal expenditures, the $9 million was not a significant limitation on our ability to do things for that legislation.
No, I know.
I just got a note here that says the total income projections that we anticipate is 7.9 million in total income.
I thought it was $6 million.
I have 6.1 in rental income and 1.8 in reimbursable services. And if we need more than that, I need the comptroller to come up and explain that.
NASA's EUL desk guidance provides direction on what costs can be considered as full costs for administering the leases. To what extent, if at all, does the Facilities Engineering and Real Property Division, or the Office of Program and Institutional Integration, review and audit these costs as being appropriate and conforming to the guidance of the Chief Financial Officer?
If I may, sir, could I invite the comptroller up?
Please.
David, do you want to?
The Office of
you'll want to identify yourself.
David Scher, NASA Comptroller. The Office of Program and Institutional Integration is responsible for running the budget process that would encompass EUL as part of our formal budget submit. Starting with the 2009 appropriation, we're required to incorporate this in the budget. So we've formalized it as part of our budget process. That office has the responsibility for collecting the requirements and vetting them across all the centers now once we get through the current stand down on new leases. So they're vetting the actual numbers that will be part of what you saw in the operating plan as well as the budget. They'll be submitted hopefully next week or so. And then the facilities engineering office has got the overall responsibility for what are they using the funds for and ensuring that they're following their particular processes. And CFO's got the general responsibility to make sure they're doing the accounting properly so it shows up in the proper accounts.
The model of the General Services Administration, which deposits rent and other receipts from its federal tenants into the Federal Buildings Fund, and every year Congress provides authority to spend those funds. Why wouldn't that model be instructive to NASA's enhanced use lease receipts?
I think effectively with the direction of the 2009 appropriation, that's what we're doing. You've asked us to provide to you a plan for what we're going to spend the monies on, the net receipts from the EUL activity, and that will be part of our submit.
But, and what is that a contingent precedent to your all spending it?
The other requirement we had is to submit to you a plan with the operating plan and the specifics of what we're spending it on. So I think both of those cover.
Has no spending gone forward with prior to the approval of that plan?
We have to take that one for the record, is what we were doing in 09 prior to the passage of the 09 appropriation.
Yeah. But the limitation that we put in the bill didn't affect, because the estimates were a lot higher, $14 million, than what you're now coming up with. Isn't that correct?
That's true. At the gross level, that would be true.
So we'd have to do something else if we're going to impact that.
If we were going to limit the amount that was spent in 09, that number would not limit it. That's correct.
Yeah. Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I'm always intrigued by the relationship between NASA and NOAA. And it seems to some of us at times like you're working on the same projects, but you certainly have different responsibilities. So my question to you is, and you might have covered this, and I apologize for this, in what areas is there joint work? And then secondly, as a aside to that, one question that I ask just about all our federal agencies that gather information, does our lack of diplomatic relations with certain places, say with Cuba, our tense relationship with places like Bolivia or Venezuela, come into play when you have information that is actually good for the people in those areas? I mean, I asked Noah, when you see a hurricane coming, and the Cubans very good at knowing where these hurricanes are coming, but do you share some information? Do you let them know, or does politics come into play and you have to hold back? So the relationship between you and NOAA, and then
NASA and NOAA have a long relationship going back to almost the formation of both agencies in the 50s and the 60s. So the NASA relationship with NOAA is multifaceted. On the one hand, we're their agent for providing the spacecraft and the instruments that collect the data on weather around the world. We have been the agent in the past for the Polar Orbiting Environmental Satellites, originally called TIROS, that started in the 1960s, and the last one was launched earlier this year. We remain, and that was replaced now where the DoD is the agent for NOAA on the NPOS project that we were just discussing. We still do the geostationary observational or geostationary orbit environmental satellites, the GOES satellites that are in geostationary orbit that actually is the image you typically see on the evening news. So we do those directly for NOAA. NOAA funds those. We're their agent for procuring them, launching them, and doing initial checkout. In addition, we do research that jointly with NOAA to improve weather forecasts, to improve severe weather forecasts. We provide data from our research satellites. I mentioned a couple of them earlier, the TRIM satellites and the EOS satellites that provide data. So our research from those satellites is shared with NOAA so they can improve their models. By the same token, their researchers are looking at ours to help us determine which kind of instruments we should go off and develop. And as far as the data, our data, and actually Dixon Butler is sitting in the back here. One of the things he did when he was at NASA was make sure that all of our data is available, so that our data doesn't have political boundaries. If you want to get the data, you can acquire it, the NASA data. Sometimes it's very esoteric, but because we don't typically do forecasts, but our data is made available. It's made available to researchers. It's made available to operational agencies around the world. In addition, many of our satellites have what we call a direct broadcast capability that allow us, if you have a receiver on the ground, you can receive our data as the satellite's coming overhead and use it for your purposes. And clearly, if desired, we can deny that service. To my knowledge, we have never been asked to deny that service. Yes. So we have it on basically continuously.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. Thank you, Mr. Solis. Hope you make your trip, your flight. I'll bet it waits for you.
Thank you, sir.
And we very much appreciate your terrific service and the great team you have that's doing that in so many different ways. And we look forward to a new administrator, and I know you all are looking forward
Yes, sir.
to a new administrator. So thank you very much for your testimony today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Hearing's adjourned.
Mention the 10,000 teachers we're training at the Institute, which each teach 200 people.